If San Bernardino shooting suspect Saeed Farouk was radicalized, as some sources suggest, that doesn't mean he was mentally ill, according to Shell Gross with the Wisconsin chapter of Mental Health America.
You know, in some cases, there may be, some of those people may get radicalized, but I don't think you have to have a mental illness in order to get radicalized.
While that may seem obvious to some, Gross cites other data which many Americans would find surprising.
If you cured all mental illness, you would reduce gun homicides by 4%. Most gun homicides are not related to mental illness.
Gross says even Robert Deere, the man charged with killing 3 people at a Planned Parenthood in Colorado last week, doesn't fit that narrative.
I haven't seen anything that suggests that he has a mental illness. I think people can look at his behavior and say, well, he sure seems pretty strange, you know, but that's different than having a mental illness.
Madison State Representative Chris Taylor, who supports stricter gun control, feels mental health is an easy out.
There are other countries that have individuals who have mental health issues. They do not have the homicide rate that we have.
Gross fears that constant link between gun violence and mental illness could have the opposite effect of leading fewer people to get help.
It adds to that stigma and makes people less likely to come forward because they think, well, now people are going to be afraid of me. They're going to assume I'm going to be violent.
It bothers me that we just assume that all of these people are mentally ill. I think there's a really interesting string of research that's being done that sort of suggests that the reason we're having this epidemic of shootings, not only the mass shootings that we see on, you know, they get all the news attention, but, you know, more than 30,000 people a year are killed by gun violence in this country.
Right.
2/3 of those are suicides, 1/3 are homicides. And the epidemic of gun violence, part of that is that every time there is a shooting, it becomes more socially acceptable. And so gun violence becomes available to people not just on the fringe, but people who are just angry. And so we need to, as a community, as a country, take a stand and say, no, gun violence is not acceptable. So not every law is going to solve the whole problem. But if we could pass some laws that would indicate that this is not socially acceptable behavior, I think that would be a real step forward in terms of curtailing this ever-increasing epidemic where gun violence becomes more and more socially acceptable.
You know, where's the political will, and do you think you'll see that in our lifetimes?
Well, yes, I certainly think so. And I think that you can only stay tone deaf to the will of your constituents for so long. And I think that it will change. I think we're seeing changes across the country and other states. And I hope that those changes will come to Wisconsin. One really interesting piece of legislation that they passed in California last year that has been introduced in Wisconsin is called the Lethal Violence Protective Order, or Families Know First. And what that would allow is if families who often know that a loved one is in crisis and has access to guns, this would allow them to get a court order to remove those guns, at least temporarily, during the period that the person's in crisis. This comes out of the mass shooting in California 2 years ago, where the family knew that their son was in crisis.
That was the young man who,
right.
Who kind of went out on the street and just started shooting people.
And the family knew, and they sent the sheriff to see him, and there was nothing the sheriff could do. So California passed a law to allow families to intervene in that situation, and that law has been introduced in Wisconsin. So I think that kind of approach, which is focused on protecting families and helping reduce the number of suicides, those kinds of approaches might have a real chance.